In London, a city of 8 million people, living their lives, going to work, meeting friends and family, and enjoying life, people were oblivious to the fact that a dangerous and highly organised serial killer stalked the streets in the west of the city. In February 2003, Marsha McDonnell, on her way home, was attacked suddenly with a hammer and died in hospital 2 days later. There was no trace of her killer. In May 2004, Kate Sheedy was run over as she crossed the street on her way home. Her attacker reversed over her and left her for dead. She survived the attack after phoning the police while in severe pain. The extreme nature of this offence against a random Londoner was brutal even for the UK's sprawling capital city. Then, in August 2004, French citizen Amélie Delagrange was assaulted on Twickenham Green in south-west London. She was attacked suddenly with a hammer and killed. At this point, the police believed that the attacks against Amélie Delagrange and Marsha McDonnell were carried out by the same person who appeared to be targeting young blonde women. An arrest was made soon afterwards. Levi Bellfield was arrested after being found hiding in his attic when his house was raided by police. At trial, he was subsequently convicted of the 2 murders and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. His method of offending appeared to be sudden, so-called blitz attacks involving extreme violence before quickly disappearing into the night. To attack in this way, an extreme rage must have existed beneath his exterior, as well as a complete lack of remorse for the victims and their families who would have to deal with the sudden loss of family members in extremely violent circumstances. During the police investigation, Amélie Delagrange's phone and handbag, which were taken from her during the attack, were found dumped in the river near Walton-on-Thames. Another notorious crime reported at the time of these offences was that of the murder of Millie Dowler, who suddenly disappeared somewhere on a short stretch of road close to Walton-on-Thames train station. Her body was found in Yateley Woods in Hampshire 6 months later. After Bellfield was convicted, he was investigated as a suspect, and it was found that he had lived in a flat with his partner on that short stretch of road. He was subsequently charged with the crime. It was suggested by the prosecution that Bellfield had waited in bushes for the young schoolgirl to walk past before grabbing her and taking her to his flat. A red car was seen on CCTV shortly after the time Millie was supposed to have disappeared, and Bellfield's partner at the time owned the same make and colour of the vehicle spotted. The pictures were enhanced by NASA after a request was made by British police. After Bellfield's convictions for these murders, links were made between his very rare method of attacking random people with a blunt instrument and the attacks in 1996 in Chillington, Kent, of a mother and her 2 young daughters, which resulted in the deaths of Lynn and Megan Russell. Josie Russell managed to survive her horrific injuries after they were discovered 8 hours after the attack. The photo fit of the suspect was said to bear a resemblance to Bellfield, possibly more so than Michael Stone, who was actually convicted of the offence. Josie stated that the attacker was taller than her father, who was 6 feet tall. Stone was 5'7" and Bellfield was 6 foot 1 inches tall. The type of offence carried out by Bellfield was extremely brutal and very rare. There were very few offences committed similar to this in which he could be ruled out as a suspect, from 1990 to the date of his arrest in 2004. However, from his convictions it is clear that his offending methods could be said to vary in 2 ways. The first being the sudden attack with a blunt instrument resulting in death or severe injury, and the second was lying in wait and then kidnapping a young girl before murdering her. The motive in the former cases were presumably a result of extreme rage against women, the motive in the latter case most likely being sexual. When Bellfield was convicted for the 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, he was also tried for 2 other offences where the jury failed to deliver verdicts. In December 2003, Irma Dragoshi was attacked with a blunt instrument in West London. She was unable to remember anything of the incident. In October 2001, a car containing 2 men stopped near Anna Marie Rennie. One man exited the vehicle and attempted to abduct her by picking her up, covering her mouth and trying to force her into the vehicle. She was luckily able to fight off her attacker. Even without using the offence of abduction and false imprisonment against Anne-Marie Rennie, which Bellfield was not convicted of, a certain pattern of offending seems to appear. Millie Dowler was kidnapped and murdered in March 2002, after which the method of offending by Bellfield changed to one where he attacked suddenly using a blunt instrument or a vehicle, causing devastating injuries. The offence against Millie Dowler was committed in a very organised fashion, and the ability of Bellfield to leave no forensic trace, as well as cover up his tracks afterwards, begs the question of whether he had ever carried out a similar offence prior to this. That is, the sudden kidnapping and murder of a girl or young woman from a West London street. In the middle of the night after Millie Dowler's disappearance, Bellfield left his partner, who was staying in a different house, and returned to their flat in order to, he is reported to have said, clear up a mess made by their dog. The next day, bed sheets and other items were missing when his partner had returned. Bellfield then forced his partner and children to leave the flat altogether. His organisation and ability in covering up his offences could demonstrate that he had offended to some extent previously. In the years prior to Millie Dowler's murder, 3 young women disappeared without trace in Ealing and Hammersmith in West London. All 3 were from ethnic minority groups, either with British or European citizenship. They were all physically similar in that they were all short and of small builds. In April 1999, Elizabeth Chow had taken the train from university back to her home in Ealing, exiting Ealing Broadway station and walking home. She even passed a police station on the way. Somewhere along the route, she went missing. Her bank account was never subsequently touched, and she was never seen again. In the following days, police were criticised for not taking her disappearance seriously straight away. A belated search was undertaken in the local area, but Elizabeth was not found. On the 3rd January 2000, which was the New Year's Day bank holiday, Lola Shenkoya, an American citizen of African descent, was unable to get into the house where she was staying, so she took a bus to Ealing Broadway and went for a walk as she waited for her sister to return and let her in. She went missing near Ealing Broadway station and was never seen again. Due to the similar circumstances of the 2 disappearances and the fact that they were geographically so close together, the police believed that the same man was responsible for both disappearances. Then in July 2000, 6 months after Lola went missing, Iwona Kaminska, a Polish citizen who had moved to London 4 days earlier, went missing after leaving work in Hammersmith and has not been seen since. These 3 disappearances were all but forgotten about for 14 years, except by the families of the missing women. Then a young English girl named Alice Gross went missing while walking in Hanwell, very close to Ealing Broadway. Her body was found several weeks later in a canal, and a Lithuanian citizen, Arnis Salkans, who committed suicide after the murder, was blamed for the killing. In the inquest into Alice Gross's murder, the police were forced to state that they believed that the serial rapist and convicted murderer Andrzej Konowski, who had subsequently died in prison, was most likely responsible for the disappearances of both Elizabeth Chow and Lola Shenkoya. However, the method of his offending differed quite considerably from attacking young women on the street and leaving no trace as to their whereabouts. The police also stated that they believed that 2 or more persons working together may have been responsible for the disappearances. They were under the impression that 2 men may have been waiting in a vehicle and one would have been responsible for the abduction while the other would have remained behind the wheel. In Bellfield's confession to Millie Dowler's murder, which he subsequently withdrew, he allegedly stated that he had an accomplice to the crime. This accomplice was questioned, however, due to the lack of any evidence, no further action was taken. The crime committed against Anne-Marie Rennie, for which a jury were unable to convict Bellfield for, bears a striking similarity to the method the police believe was used to abduct the three young women in Ealing and Hammersmith. If we were to speculate that Bellfield was somehow involved in these disappearances and the offences against Anna Marie Rennie and Irma Dragosci, which are all offences for which Bellfield has either not been convicted or charged with, then the pattern of offending would be described as follows. From April 1999 to March 2002, Bellfield and possible accomplices were abducting and murdering young women for a possible sexual motive. Then from February 2003 to August 2004, he was committing sudden violent attacks using a blunt instrument, possibly a hammer, leaving very little evidence at the scene. If we were to include the 1996 Russell murders in this timeline, then the period of offending becomes much longer. However, the type of violent offence by our hypothetical offender committed in this speculative timeline changes distinctly in between 1996 and 1999. So what could have changed or influenced an offender to alter his method and motive of offending during these 3 years? There was also another unsolved murder in the years between 1996 and 1999. Hannah de Turville, a young British woman of Afro-Caribbean descent from Greenford, West London, went missing in 1998 and was found stabbed to death on a golf course several days later. The police believed that she had been killed and then carried by more than one person to where her body was found. On the face of it, the crime does not appear to have any link to the other incidents and offences, except for the fact that it occurred in West London. However, she went missing on the 2nd January 1998, which was the New Year's Monday bank holiday, 2 years exactly before Lola Shenkoya, also of Afro-Caribbean descent, went missing. A murder involving an abduction by two people and a young woman going missing fits the pattern of the following years from 1999 to 2002. Prior to this, there was another highly significant and notorious crime for which no one was convicted and remains unsolved. A report by the National Crime Agency into other offences believed by police to have been committed by Bellfield, which was collated in 2008 but only reported in 2007, included 2 incidents of attacks with a blunt instrument in January 2004 in Hastings, East Sussex. In February 1997, only 275 yards away from the locations of these 2 attacks, Billie Jo Jenkins, a young girl, was bludgeoned to death with a metal tent peg. She was painting doors at the back of her home at the time. Her adopted father, Sean Jenkins, was charged with her murder, convicted, and then freed on appeal. Sean Jenkins entered the house for several minutes while his family waited in a car before they went on a short shopping trip. He was said to have committed the crime at this time. However, the rear of the house appeared to be easily accessible from the street, and Billie Jo Jenkins' sister stated that the side gate to their home may have been open when the family returned from their shopping trip. A large park sits opposite the house, and someone could easily have hidden in bushes and observed the houses on the street without being noticed. Due to the ferocity of the crime, and the fact that Bellfield was convicted of sudden, devastating attacks with blunt instruments, he could be considered a possible suspect for this offence, especially since he was considered a suspect for the 2 offences several years later on a road on the other side of the park. If the murder was carried out by a stranger, the audacity and nature of the attack would fit into Bellfield's pattern of offending behaviour. Prior to the Russell murders, which were less than a year before Billie Jo Jenkins' murder, the police believe that Bellfield could also be a suspect in the murder of Judith Gold, a 51-year-old mother of 3 in Hampstead, north-west London in 1990. She was attacked in the street with a blunt instrument, and the police have never been able to find her killer. Due to the random nature, extreme violence and organisation involved in the murders of the Russells, it could possibly be speculated that this was not the hypothetical offender's first violent offence, concerning victims unknown to him. If the same murderer could be assumed to have been responsible for the murders of Judith Gold and the Russells, a gap of 6 years would have passed between these offences. It would therefore be feasible to suggest that the killer could have committed further similar offences in this period. During this time, there were 2 unsolved murders of women in West London. In 1991, Penny Bell, a 43-year-old woman, was stabbed to death as she sat in her car in a car park. Then in 1993, Jean Bradley, a 47-year-old woman, was also stabbed to death. In speculating about whether the same offender was responsible for all these offences, including those which Bellfield had been convicted of, a seemingly logical timeline and pattern of offending emerges. From 1990 to 1996, the offender would have committed offences against women in their mid to late 40s and early 50s, ending with the attack against Lynn Russell and her daughters. After murdering a child, the offender could have possibly become emboldened and more inclined to attack children. Then, in 1997, Billy Joe Jenkins was murdered in Hastings. This offence drew a huge amount of media attention and may have scared the offender, who appeared to be highly organised and able to compartmentalise, as well as being adept at disposing of evidence. The offender could possibly then have stopped committing similar offences to stop attention being drawn to himself. The criminal behaviour then changed to a new type of violent offence, possibly involving an accomplice on some occasions. Starting in 1998 with the first murder involving the stabbing and dumping of a victim, then evolving into similar offences where bodies were not discovered, the offender and accomplice would have abducted young women, finally ending in 2002 with the murder of Millie Dowler, a notorious murder which resulted in a huge amount of media coverage. This attention would have possibly scared the killer into halting that particular type of offending, again in order to save themselves from being caught. At this point, the offender's real self emerges, and he or she again begins to attack women with blunt instruments. This time, young blonde women would be attacked and murdered from 2003 to 2004, until the offender's possible apprehension by the police. There is one other crime that appears to be significant in regard to Bellfield's offending history. Patsy Morris, a 14-year-old girl who was known to Bellfield, was murdered in 1980, and her body found on Hounslow Heath. Bellfield was only 12 years old, but police have stated that he is a possible suspect in this crime. However, this would perhaps be too young an age to commit an offence of this type. In some ways, Bellfield can be described as a lucky offender because he seemingly spent years offending without any police knowledge of his extremely violent criminal activity. So from all we now know about him, anything could potentially be possible, however surprising, especially due to the extremely rare and brutal nature of his crimes. Ted Bundy, the notorious and prolific American serial killer who was thought to have murdered dozens of young women in the 1970s, bears some similarities to our hypothetical offender in terms of his offending pattern. On the surface, if we compare Bundy and specifically Bellfield, the two killers appear different both physically and in social standing or class. Bundy, who was executed in 1989, was considered attractive, educated and intelligent, while Bellfield could be described as a man whom no woman would even look twice at. He was also relatively uneducated. However, there are some striking similarities when comparing Bundy's suspected criminal history and the offender timeline described previously. When Bundy was 14 years old, a 9-year-old girl named Anne-Marie Burr went missing in the same town where Bundy lived, and years later he was thought to be a suspect, primarily because he apparently knew the girl and was suspected by the girl's father. A similar comparison could be made to the murder of Patsy Morris, and Bellfield being considered a suspect. In Bundy's teenage years, during the 1960s, he was suspected of committing a number of violent assaults with blunt instruments on young women, including 2 air stewardesses in their apartment, which resulted in the death of one of them. At the start of our hypothetical offenders timeline, the initial known history of assaults with blunt instruments continues from 1990 to 1996. Suddenly, from 1973 to 1975, Bundy had developed into a highly organised and violent serial killer whose method involved abducting women, rendering them unconscious or dead, sexually assaulting them and then killing them if they were still alive. He was highly organised in the disposal of his victims, leaving their bodies in woodland so they would decompose or be eaten by foraging wild animals. He would travel long distances, first to offend, then again to the sites where he dumped his victims. He would bury some, throw others into rivers, and leave others to the elements. Very little was found of them afterwards. In our offenders timeline, which includes some of Bellfield's offences, young women are abducted to never be seen again, or found buried in woodland, with the exception of the 1998 murder of Hannah de Turville. This crime could possibly be described as one of the first offences committed of this type, where the offender was still developing and learning. After this murder, women went missing and no bodies were found. Finally, Ted Bundy was caught due to the sheer number of brazen offences he'd committed, which eventually led him drawing attention to himself and being caught. He then escaped from prison, fled to Florida, and after a brief period of non-offending, committed a series of very violent murders. His urges had remained dormant while incarcerated, building up to a crescendo in which he entered a sorority house on a university campus and in several minutes murdered 2 women with a blunt instrument and severely injured 2 others. Several days later in another town, he used a stolen vehicle to kidnap a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach, who he murdered, presumably with a knife he had purchased in the days running up to the attack. His urges had now reached a stage where he was unable to organise his deviant actions as he had before his original arrest. Bellfield's final period of offending ran from 2002 to at least August 2004. In our fictitious offender's pattern of offending, he or she reverted back to their original criminal behaviour, which involved random attacks with a blunt instrument causing catastrophic head injuries. By this point, the offender's urge to kill or harm, as in Bundy's case, had become overwhelming. The victims were predominantly young, blonde women. This series of crimes could have started after the murder of Millie Dowler, which attracted a huge amount of media coverage, therefore scaring Bellfield into not offending for a period. Gradually his urges would have grown, resulting in a series of offences less organised than before and leading to his capture. In our offenders timeline, the murder of the young girl came at the beginning of the final period of killing, rather than, in Bundy's case, at the end with the murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy therefore demonstrated a similar distinct difference in offending as our hypothetical offender whose crimes include Bellfield's, and exhibited a similar way of reoffending after a period of relative calm. Both Bundy and Bellfield had offended prolifically before police even suspected their involvement in any offences. During Ted Bundy's incarceration, to avoid incrimination, he talked in the third person about a hypothetical offender who committed the same crimes of which he was suspected and charged. Psychologists who have heard these interviews had no doubt that he was talking about his own first-hand experiences. He stated that before the offender had started killing, he had sudden urges to assault women who he had spotted when out walking late at night. He described the incidents where he picked up blunt objects such as wooden planks, followed women, and then struck them on the head before quickly leaving the scene. He then stated that he progressed to the abduction and murder of women exactly like our hypothetical offender, whose crimes also include Bellfield's. During talks with psychiatrists, Bundy described his early development and how he was unable to truly understand how people were able to form friendships or want to be with others. He went on to describe the intricate fantasies he slowly developed over long periods where he was left alone. These appear to be of 2 distinct varieties. Firstly, hero fantasies, where he would, for example, rescue and impress damsels in distress. Secondly, sexual fantasies, where violence and sex slowly became increasingly interlinked. Psychiatrists who have interviewed serial killers state that once a young male's sexual fantasies involve violence, it becomes very difficult to alter and therefore treat effectively. Bundy's interviewers concluded that he was brilliant at rationalizing his actions and compartmentalizing his behavior so he could thrive effectively in society alongside people who had no idea about his aberrant behavior. He therefore appeared to have a normal private life where his family and friends had absolutely no suspicions of his secret life. It was only late in his offending, when women began disappearing wherever he was known to live, that his girlfriend decided to report her suspicions to the police. She also grew suspicious of items she had found in his belongings which she could not explain. Bellfield's partner also discovered suspicious items including magazines with women's faces scratched out, as well as a coat, balaclava and knife. Bellfield was also able to thrive effectively in both his personal and working life, having started a number of different businesses. One of the main characteristics in Bundy's offending was gaining absolute control over a victim to turn them into whatever he wanted them to be. Bellfield's relationships with his partners were incredibly controlling, as he appeared to view women and children as possessions which he owned. Due to Bundy's lack of social understanding, he too viewed life materialistically, and as a result he craved possessions. He viewed his victims in a similar way and wanted to possess them. It followed that Bundy saw his social standing and how he appeared to others as incredibly important. As an example, when he discovered that he was illegitimate, it affected him very detrimentally, perhaps unreasonably so. He looked to climb the social ladder and dated a young lady from a higher strata of society than he perceived himself to come from. When this relationship ended, he was distraught. This rejection perhaps caused his extreme rage to fester and explode. His victims invariably came from a certain comfortable middle or upper class background. He stole expensive items and killed the type of women who he aspired to be with. He feared women because of the way they made him feel, and he wanted to control them. The dominant romantic hero fantasy disappeared and was substituted for the other extreme, a deviant and repulsive one. Bellfield also invariably targeted young middle-class women who were far removed from the people he usually associated with. In London, the rich rub shoulders alongside the poor, but the class barriers, even though somewhat weakened to a great extent, still remain. Bellfield would have grown up in this environment and perhaps craved to climb a social ladder of sorts. He was arrogant and saw himself as special. Whether he felt let down by some similar incident to that which Bundy experienced, such as a perceived broken social promise, is unknown. However, it would be fair to assume that something must have released his latent degeneracy. Bundy's interviewers eventually came to believe that he suffered from a serious case of arrested development. He was childlike in many ways and would continue to deny involvement in offences without providing any alternative explanations or alibis, similar to a child denying causing damage while playing in a house after being caught by a parent. Bellfield himself was said by friends and relatives to deny his offences for fear of upsetting his mother, who it was said that he was very close to. When discussing a motive for a hypothetical offender, Bundy stated that the stalking of a potential victim was the most important element. Any sexual assault committed was apparently secondary to the main motive of playing God, deciding if someone would live or die. This would fit into a possible motive for Bellfield's crimes, as they were predominantly quick and sudden violent attacks. Both Bundy and Bellfield were affected by a seemingly uncontrollable rage against women, possibly stemming from a neurotic need to control or possess women. An egotistical arrogance would have developed over a period of time, resulting in both a lack of any empathy towards victims or their families, which increased the likelihood of offending after any trigger event. The lack of remorse possibly stemmed from their unreal ability to view people as possessions only. The true self eventually emerged after years of compartmentalization, when the lines of separation began to blur and a mask of sanity slipped away. In Bundy's case, his interviewers described a hunchback monster which eventually revealed itself after his escape from prison. In his trial he made a series of illogical decisions and was unable to perceive the overall case against him as being objectively strong. He was unable to understand why people were after him, and was completely oblivious to the devastation he had caused to so many people. He had always thought that no one would care if someone else went missing or died. The hunchback had revealed itself. With Bellfield, the hunchback revealed itself with his confident abduction and murder of Millie Dowler right from outside his home, and then in the repeated hammer attacks against young women in the same area. He always denied his guilt, having made sure to dispose of any evidence linking him to the crime. Yet in his trial for the Dowler murder, he could not understand why a circumstantial case against him could appear so strong. After Bellfield was arrested in West London, a violent, prolific serial killer had been taken off the streets. Many questions remain as to whether he had murdered more people. West London had already been the scene of a number of unsolved murders: Jill Dando, Susie Lamplugh, and until recent years, Rachel Nickell. In the face of organised killers, the police appear to have found it very difficult to find either suspects or enough evidence to convict. London is a city of anonymous residents where a killer like Levi Bellfield could commit crimes at will with little fear of being caught for many years. Due to the extreme rarity of highly organised offenders like Bundy or Bellfield who attack victims unknown to them, there still appears to be no real way of preventing attacks except by the use of deterrents such as CCTV and forensics after the offences have been committed. Our hypothetical offender could not have been stopped before he had started to kill. However, there appeared to have been a time when there may have been a chance to stop him before he had killed more women. In 2014, Alice Gross went missing a short distance away from where Elizabeth Chow and Lola Shenkoya disappeared in 1999 and 2000. The police search for Alice was the Metropolitan Police's biggest use of manpower since the terrorist attacks in London in 2005. The discrepancy in the importance seemingly attached to each of these disappearances is startling and significant. If a similar use of manpower was used in the cases of Elizabeth and Lola, then perhaps an offender could have been caught due to the extensive investigations and resultant massive media coverage. If Bellfield was responsible for these attacks, then there could possibly have been a chance of apprehending him at that time, before he attacked so many other women. In order to develop an adequate form of prevention before crimes of this type can take place, advanced psychological studies would need to take place in controlled environments with relevant subjects. Despite all the psychiatrist interviews with Bundy, to this day people are still asking questions about his motives, almost 30 years after he was executed.